Today, we welcome the Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas. Mr. Secretary, on behalf of the subcommittee, I would like to share our appreciation to you and the over 260,000 employees of the department for their dedication to our nation's security and resiliency. We are very mindful of the wide-ranging responsibilities and the sacrifices that are necessary in order to uphold the responsibilities for your department. The purpose of today's hearing is to review the President's FY24 budget request for the Department of Homeland Security. As we start this effort, I'd like to share my intention to work with Ranking Member Britt and the rest of the members of this subcommittee to develop and pass a bipartisan bill that protects our nation. And I'm very glad that Chair Murray and Vice Chair Collins, who is here, are committed to restoring regular order. In the past, it has honestly often been this subcommittee's budget that has caused the most heartburn when it comes to regular order, but I think it's time that we put this budget and all the rest before the committee, allowed for amendments, and had a real debate about our nation's security. I think that's good for the country. I think that's good for the Senate. Mr. Secretary, let me just quickly tell you what I'm interested in hearing about today and talking to you about. As you know, there is a plague afoot in our nation, a plague of drug addiction and death, the likes of which this country has never witnessed before. There's no one answer, but this budget better do everything humanly possible to stop the import of deadly fentanyl into the United States. This is a red alert moment. And while DHS alone can't come close to solving this crisis, I plan on pushing to dramatically scale up every capability that you have and the department has to stop the flow of these poisons into our homeland. This topic is so important, in fact, that we're going to devote an entire hearing to drilling down on the parts of the budget that help interrupt the fentanyl trade. That's going to be May 3rd, so whatever we don't get to today, we'll get to then. I also want to hear about your plan for lifting Title 42. People in this building often pretend that you have the legal ability to just keep denying entry to migrants indefinitely under Title 42. You don't. You'd be breaking the law if you kept applying Title 42 after the pandemic. But we know there's likely going to be a surge of crossings once Title 42 expires. And we've seen the President's announcement about new policy and processes to meet this moment, but we want to know what the post-Title 42 world looks like from a spending and appropriations perspective. Mr. Secretary, I also want to hear about the state of our disaster response fund, whether we have enough money and when we're going to need more. I'd like to hear about our cybersecurity efforts. They have grown exponentially, but I'm not always sure whether our extra capabilities actually match all of the extra spending that we've put in. And lastly, I'd like to hear about our efforts to build storm and climate resiliency. Both the ranking member and I come from coastal states, and whether or not you think fighting climate change is job number one or not, our coasts are being battered, and we need help, not just in the aftermath of a disaster. Lastly, Mr. Secretary, let me just make a personal point. I think you are an exceptional leader. I don't agree with you 100% of the time, but I think you've been given an impossible task, perhaps the hardest job in the federal government. You didn't get drafted for this assignment. You volunteered for it because you're a patriot, because you believe in this country. Frankly, Mr. Secretary, I think the way that you were treated in the Judiciary Committee yesterday was shameful. There are some senators here who think their job is to create confrontation so they can book cable news appearances. And frankly, the lack of self-awareness from individuals in the Senate who have stood on the sidelines as we have attempted to try to find bipartisan compromise is pretty stunning. Congress has just fallen down on the job and refused to update the immigration laws of this nation for 40 years as conditions at the border and the conditions of migration have radically changed. Every Secretary of Homeland Security, Republican and Democrat, has been charged with enforcing bad law, expired law, irrelevant law. And occasionally, secretaries need to be creative in order to protect the nation, make sure that it lives up to its values, despite Congress's failure. And so I hope, I trust that you will be treated better by this committee, not because members of this subcommittee will agree with you or the administration, but because this subcommittee, year after year, despite our disagreements, finds a way to do our job and produce a bipartisan budget for DHS and the border. And I have confidence that we will do it again this year. With that, I'll turn it over to the ranking member, Senator Britt, for opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am looking forward to serving alongside you on this important committee. I also want to thank Chair Murray and Vice Chair Collins for your leadership. Ensuring that we do everything possible to get back to regular order is of the utmost importance, and we're proud to be a part of it. And I also appreciate the opportunity to serve in this capacity. Vice Chair Collins, thank you. Mr. Secretary, I appreciate you testifying today on fiscal year 2024 budget request for the Department of Homeland Security. First, I'd like to recognize the hard work of the men and women of the department, from protecting our borders to safeguarding cyberspace and critical infrastructure, from responding to natural disasters to guarding our coastlines and keeping Americans safe as they travel by planes, buses, and rails. DHS plays a critical role in securing our nation, keeping families safe, and communities strong. Additionally, I am proud of the work that is performed throughout the great state of Alabama for the department. While I have the utmost respect for the tens of thousands of DHS agents, officers, and employees who work tirelessly to protect our nation, I am very concerned about the many homeland security policies of this administration, particularly when it comes to the border. These policies have not just budgetary cost, but human cost as well. I have seen little pairs of shoes at the border and know that those children have a story. I have seen a baby shivering wet after being carried across the Rio Grande. I have looked into CBP officers' eyes as they tell me about pulling a woman pregnant with twins out of the water after she drowned. Sadly, this administration's budget proposal doubles down on failed policies that encourage these kinds of tragedies to happen every day. At a time when we are facing unparalleled threats both at home and abroad, President Biden's Department of Homeland Security-based budget actually calls for a cut of $650 million, or nearly 1% of your fiscal year 2023 funding. It is one of the only departments subject to a decreased budget request, and it begs the question: how can President Biden expect anyone to believe he is serious about enforcing our nation's immigration laws, preventing the exploitation of children, stopping bad actors in cyberspace, keeping Americans safe as they travel, stemming the flow of fentanyl, which killed a record number of Alabamians and Americans last year? And the candid answer is he cannot. Let's start with securing our border and enforcing the laws. In fiscal year 2022, there were around 2.4 million encounters along the southwest border, and this does not include the over 500,000 gotaways that evaded arrest last year. We are on pace to see similar levels in FY23 and will likely break the record given the end of Title 42 usage in May. In fact, Mr. Secretary, your own department projects that when Title 42 goes away, we could see monthly encounter levels of nearly 400,000, a 150% increase over the historically high levels we see now. But President Biden's budget request for Customs and Border Protection is a decrease of $1.3 billion, and his plan has as many gaps in it as the wall that this administration refuses to finish. President Biden's budget seeks to hire just 350 additional Border Patrol agents to address the expected surge of migrants. At the same time, it is hiring 87,000 new IRS agents. I have traveled to the border 3 times in just the first 2 months of my time here in the Senate, and I can tell you that reducing resources for border security is not the way to go. And that's just the border. What about immigration enforcement in the interior of the country? Because of this administration's policies, there are nearly 600,000 migrants who arrive in the United States within the past 2 years who were subject to removal but did not receive charging documents, and in some cases will be waiting more than a decade, more than 10 years, just to begin their formal removal process. That doesn't even include the years that they will have to wait to actually go through the removal proceedings, and many of these people here illegally will get lost in the wind. Some commit a crime, some maybe worse. Despite the legal requirement to detain migrants facing removal, yet again, President Biden's budget requests fewer resources for detention beds and alternatives to detention. In fact, this administration seeks to decrease the budget for immigration and customs enforcement by nearly $500 million, a clear indication the president is not serious about enforcement. I can only imagine what impacts these proposed cuts to Customs and Border Protection and Immigration and Customs Enforcements have on morale. Finally, we cannot talk about the border crisis without talking about fentanyl. In 2021, there were over 105 Americans, including more than 1,000 Alabamians, that died from drug overdoses, predominantly due to fentanyl. Fentanyl is now the leading cause of death of Americans between the ages of 18 and 45. I want to commend the brave men and women of CBP, ICE, and the U.S. Coast Guard who are on the front lines every day to interdict fentanyl and other illicit drugs. But the numbers are alarming. For all of fiscal year 2022, they seized 14,700 pounds of fentanyl. That is enough fentanyl to kill every single American. Less than halfway through the fiscal year 2023, CBP has nearly matched that number, and we are on pace to double last year's fiscal totals. However, as my colleague from West Virginia pointed out in her recent floor speech, President's budget, fentanyl is actually only mentioned twice, but climate is mentioned 148 times. In fact, President Biden's budget request includes only $300 million for fentanyl detection equipment at CBP and $40 million for ICE operations to combat fentanyl trafficking. And $40 million is nothing when you compare it to $60 million that this administration spends each year on doing laundry for those migrants. And this total pales in comparison to President Biden's ask of $4 billion for ambiguous, ill-defined initiatives in FEMA's budget that have no actual bearing on the federal government's ability to respond swiftly and compassionately when counties in my home state like Dallas, Elmore, Greene, Morgan, Sumter are ravaged by tornadoes and storms. I cannot emphasize enough that we must make real and lasting impacts so that we can stop the cartels, stop the manufacturers of precursors, and stop the senseless deaths of Americans due to fentanyl. There are many other issues for us to discuss in your budget, from different things, TSA pay raise to inadequate operational funding for the U.S. Coast Guard to proposed cuts in how law enforcement teams get trained at DHS. But as a mom, I am especially concerned with the department's proposed cuts to school safety programs. Horrific tragedies, acts of pure evil, like the ones we saw this week in Nashville, are heartbreaking. Reminders that we have a lot of work to do. We must do that work together in a bipartisan way to keep our children safe, to protect their lives, to protect their opportunity to live the American dream. Mr. Secretary, the department does important work in this area. However, the president's budget seeks to cut funding for the school safety work done by both the National Threat Assessment Center and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. For the third year in a row, the Biden administration has submitted a budget that does not make a serious effort to solving the vast problems of which the Department of Homeland Security has direct purview. I look forward to having a robust, thoughtful discussion today and beyond on these critical issues and other things as we work together to solve the problems that are before us. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity and look forward to the hearing.
Look forward to it as well and to working with you, Ranking Member Britt. I'll now recognize Secretary Mayorkas for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Chairman Murphy, Ranking Member Britt, distinguished members of the committee. On Sunday, I traveled to Rolling Fork, Mississippi to assure the residents there and others in Mississippi devastated by the tornadoes that had just struck that our department will support their recovery in the days, weeks, and months ahead. More than 20 people lost their lives, and many more lost their homes and all they possessed. I was privileged to be alongside Senator Hyde-Smith, Senator Wicker, and Governor Reeves. If I may, Senator Hyde-Smith spoke so poignantly to the people of Rolling Fork. On Monday, I spoke with Senators Blackburn and Hagerty and with Governor Lee and Mayor Cooper and offered our department's support in response to the too tragic and senseless murder of children and adults at St. Paul Christian School in Nashville, Tennessee. Our thoughts, prayers, and support are with the people who are suffering today. Over the past 20 years, the department has evolved and responded capably to an increasingly dynamic threat landscape. We have done this through the unflinching dedication of the department's 260,000 public servants, the third largest workforce in the federal government. Every day, these heroes work to ensure the safety of Americans in the skies and on the seas, secure our borders, promote lawful trade and travel, provide relief when disaster strikes, advance the security of cyberspace and critical infrastructure, stop cartels from trafficking illegal drugs into our communities, combat human trafficking and online child sexual exploitation, protect our interests in the Arctic and Indo-Pacific, and much more. The threats and challenges facing the homeland have never been more complex or dynamic. The President's fiscal year 2024 budget for DHS was crafted to meet these threats and challenges strategically and responsibly, ensuring our department has the tools it needs to keep our communities safe. The displacement of people across the region is greater than at any time since World War II. I have visited the southwest border approximately 16 times as Secretary to meet with our personnel and to see firsthand the challenges they face and the tools they need to do their jobs. The FY24 budget proposes the hiring of more than 1,400 additional personnel to secure the southwest border, including 350 additional Border Patrol agents and 310 additional Border Patrol processing coordinators to get more agents back into the field performing their critical law enforcement mission. The budget proposes $535 million in new funds for border technology, $305 million of which is to deploy new technologies and capabilities in our fight against the trafficking of fentanyl through our ports of entry. The threat environment we face along the southwest border is dynamic, and the annual appropriations process does not provide the flexibility to address challenges that often change sector to sector, month to month. We propose that Congress create a fund that can be spent for specific purposes when certain migrant encounter thresholds are met. This would equip our personnel with the tools they need to meet migration surges if and as they occur, like transportation resources, soft-sided facilities for processing, and grants to support state and local community reception. The budget will also enable the department to process the increasing number of asylum cases, address the backlog of applications for immigration benefits, support the Citizenship and Integration Grant Program, and improve refugee processing to meet the goal of admitting up to 125,000 refugees. Our schools, hospitals, businesses, local governments, and critical infrastructure are increasingly the targets of cyber attacks launched by transnational criminal organizations and hostile nation-states, including the People's Republic of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. This budget invests in personnel, infrastructure, and enhanced tools and services to increase the cybersecurity preparedness and resilience of our networks and critical infrastructure. We must also continue to build a culture of preparedness so that communities on the front lines of climate change and increasing extreme weather events are informed, ready, and resilient. This budget provides $20.1 billion for FEMA to assist individuals and state, local, tribal, and territorial partners impacted by major disasters and funds whole-of-community efforts in building climate resilience. The United States Coast Guard provides critical capabilities and broad authorities to defend our national interests in the Western Hemisphere, the Arctic, and the Indo-Pacific. This budget makes strategic investments in the Coast Guard's fleet of offshore patrol cutters and polar security cutters that will advance our safety, security, and economic prosperity. Finally, the men and women of DHS who serve our nation are our most important and vital resource. We cannot expect to recruit and retain a world-class, diverse workforce if they are not compensated fairly. We are asking for $1.4 billion to honor the promise of pay fairness for our TSA workforce. This budget will enable the department to respond to the threats of today and prepare for the threats of tomorrow. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. We'll now begin a series of, I see 7-minute questions according to my clock. I think one of the most difficult things this committee will have to deal with is this rather unusual request to set aside a significant portion of funding that would be used, as you mentioned, in the case of certain thresholds being crossed. It makes it a little hard to have full transparency about the efficacy of the underlying budget request, because, as you said, you would be using some of those dollars, for instance, to supplement USCIS processes. And so I think this is an ongoing conversation we're going to have to use. I'm not sure that we're doing our job as a committee if we are sort of handing a very big chunk of unearmarked dollars to the department. But I wanted to ask you specifically about the plan that the president has announced regarding a new process for asylum as a means to try to better manage the numbers that are presenting at the border today, but are expected to come to the border when Title 42 is lifted. This new process contemplates that individuals will apply before they arrive at the United States, or they will set up an appointment, and if they don't, they will either be returned to their home country or back across the border to Mexico. Where do you lack funding? Where are the parts of the budget that you are going to need the most significant additions in order to implement that new process and that new pending rule? The rule's gotten flack from the left, it's gotten flack from the right. That probably means it's worth considering. But where are you under-resourced if you were successful in implementing the president's new plan?
Mr. Chairman, if I could take a step back for just a moment. The model that we are implementing is a model of building safe, orderly, and lawful pathways to come to the United States to make a claim for humanitarian relief under the laws that Congress passed, and to deliver a consequence for individuals who do not avail themselves of that safe, orderly, and lawful pathway. We announced on January 5th such a model for Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, and Venezuelan migrants, and we have seen through that program a 95% drop in the number of individuals from those 4 countries arriving at our southern border in between the ports of entry. That is the model that we are building on, and that is what this rule, this proposed rule, provides. It is indeed that a proposed rule. We sought public comments. The public comment period, I think, closed this past Monday. Here, too, we're seeking to cut out the smugglers for the very compelling reasons that Ranking Member Britt articulated. We see too much suffering, too much tragedy at the hands of those smuggling organizations. The budget, the financial needs that we have to really fund this program, as well as all programs that we are implementing, is across the board. We need more asylum officers in U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. We need more Customs and Border Protection, Border Patrol agents, and Office of Field Operations officers. We need more Homeland Security investigation agents alike, because one cannot take a look at this program in isolation. It is part of the mosaic of the challenge of immigration that we are encountering as we seek to administer a system that is fundamentally broken.
Thank you for that, and look forward to working with you on that request. Let me talk to you about fentanyl for a moment. A bipartisan delegation just came back from Mexico City. We spent about 4 hours with the Mexican president. We pressed him on offers of cooperation that we have made to his government to try to work together on identifying precursor shipments and fentanyl labs so that we can take joint action, or so that the Mexican government can take action. If we were to dramatically upscale resources to HSI and to the other capabilities that you provide in cooperation to and with the Mexican government, could you spend it? Or are you having a tough time convincing President López Obrador and his team to do the kind of cooperative activity that we know will be effective in identifying fentanyl before it reaches our border?
Mr. Chairman, this is the single greatest challenge we face as a country. more than 70,000 people, Americans, died last year from fentanyl overdose deaths. I think it was 57,800 died in 2020 in the last year of the Trump administration. This is a scourge that has been years long, and we are bringing the fight to the cartels. We are working cooperatively with our Mexican counterparts. We can spend the money, and the money is vitally necessary to resource our fight against the scourge of fentanyl. We have transnational criminal investigative units that Homeland Security Investigations special agents work with their Mexican counterparts. We are increasing the ability of Mexico to secure its seaport, because its seaport receives precursor chemicals and manufacturing equipment from the People's Republic of China for the manufacture of fentanyl. We can spend the money, we need the funding, and the fiscal year 24 budget that the President has presented does indeed resource this department.
I hope that you're right. I mean, I think if past is predicate, we have had difficulty in convincing the Mexican government to take our offers. I felt that the President was very open, I think, in a new and helpful way, and I think we'll look forward to working with you on that. I have one final question. It's this. There's a lot of questions that get thrown around at hearings like this to ask you and others who appear before us to define the conditions at the border. Sometimes the question is the border secure? Sometimes the question is, do we have operational control at the border? I think those words mean something different to everybody, and so I think it's a difficult conversation to have. But how do you define whether the border is secure, whether we have operational control at the border? How do you talk to the public about the state of security at the border today?
Mr. Chairman, indeed, different people provide different assessments. There is no question that the security of the southern border is an extraordinary challenge. We cannot understate the severity of the challenge. That challenge is not unique to the southern border of the United States. That is a challenge that countries throughout our hemisphere are encountering and grappling with. And I cite Colombia as a powerful example. The population of Venezuela is approximately 28 million people, approximately 8 million of whom have fled the country that is their home, and Colombia is host to approximately 2.5 million of them. This, we are seeing movement of Peruvians, Ecuadorians, Dominicans, Chileans. We are seeing a movement of people throughout the hemisphere that is the greatest migration in our region since World War II. The way I make the assessment, I do not, of course, I enforce the law. That is my responsibility. It has been a responsibility that I have proudly carried and fulfilled for my nearly 23 years of public service, the first 12 of which I served as a federal prosecutor. So, of course, I enforce the law of the Secure Fence Act of 2006 and every other law that Congress has passed. But the Secure Fence Act of 2006 defines operational control as the prevention of all unlawful entries at our border. That means that one single gotaway means it would equal the failure to have operational control of our border. And so under that definition, no administration has ever had operational control. So what I try to do in communicating to the public is be practical and speak to them in a way that they could understand, so that not every single administration has to throw its hands up and say we've never had operational control. I speak of maximizing the resources that we have to deliver the most effective results.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Senator Britt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, as you know, we have limited time, so I want to get started off with just some very high-level questions, yes or no, and then we can get into details as time allows. First, do you believe that there is a crisis at the southwest border?
Ranking Member Britt, I think there is a very serious challenge at the southern border, as I have articulated.
Yes, sir. Are you willing to call it a crisis?
I consider it a very significant challenge, and I am focused on the substance of the issue and the devotion of resources most effectively to address the challenge that we confront as a country.
Yes, sir. I'm disappointed to not hear you call it a crisis, truly, because I think that's what we have before us. When we look at the budget that President Biden put forward, it's clear that this administration is not afraid of calling out a crisis when they believe they see one. I will note that we have mentioned in the budget a climate crisis. We have mentioned a youth mental crisis. We have a maternal health crisis, a behavioral health crisis. We have a wildfire crisis. We have a crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous persons. We have a biodiversity crisis, and we even have a roadway and pedestrian safety crisis. Now, my point here is not to diminish the seriousness of each and every one of those topics that I just listed. It is to show that President Biden and this administration is not afraid of calling out a crisis if they believe they have one. So I ask you one more time, do you believe we have a crisis at the southwest border?
Ranking Member Britt, let me assure you that whatever language is used does not impact the fact that we are devoting every ounce of energy to address the challenge.
I am hopeful that we can get on the same page about this. When you look at what happens, what would trigger this? If you look at Title 42 ending on May 11th, your own department has said we're going to see almost probably doubled numbers coming across the border at that point in time. Will that elevate it to this administration being able to call it for what it is, a crisis?
Ranking Member Britt, what we have done is we have provided projections, not necessarily in terms of what we anticipate seeing, but rather what we need to plan for.
Well, let's talk about fentanyl then. When we see how much is coming over the border, I mentioned it, and it has already been mentioned here by the chair, but we lost over 100,000 people to drug overdoses, and 70,000 of those, as you mentioned yourself, are attributed to fentanyl. When we look at what's coming across the border, you said in your testimony right now that that is the single greatest challenge facing our nation. So do you believe we have a fentanyl crisis in this nation?
I think the word that you used, Ranking Member Britt, is so appropriate, that we have a scourge of fentanyl. I think it's over 70,000 American lives have been lost. And
is that coming, the majority of that fentanyl coming over the southwest border?
It is coming through. I think it is more than 90% is actually being trafficked through the ports of entry at our southern border. Yes,
what are we doing to be able to capture that at the ports of entry?
So we have surged resources to an unprecedented degree to detect, to interdict the fentanyl from coming, and to investigate and prosecute the individuals who are traffickers.
Okay, what are we doing? Obviously, it has been made note that the Chinese Communist Party are sending those precursors over to Mexico, and what are we doing to disrupt and dismantle that transnational criminal organization, to disrupt that network?
We have brought unprecedented force to that effort, Ranking Member Britt, and I'd like to just cite the new surge operation that we launched last week, Operation Blue Lotus, that I directed, of Homeland Security investigations. We have brought additional Homeland Security investigations agents to the ports of entry so that they have an increased and immediate physical presence there, not only for the assistance in the interdiction of the drugs, but critically for the immediate investigation, apprehension, and ultimately prosecution of the traffickers themselves.
And I appreciate that, and I want you to hear me say we've got to continue to do more. This is affecting communities all across our country. It is affecting children. It is the leading cause of death between the ages of 18 and 45 in this nation. It is without a doubt a crisis. And I will say once again that I am disappointed that I can't hear you say those words as well. Additionally, I'd like to talk about the border and its security. The chair has already alluded to the fact that whether we talk about operational control or whether we talk about maximizing resources, I'm actually not interested in those definitions. What I am interested in is, from your perspective as the Secretary of Homeland Security, do you believe we have a secure border?
Ranking Member Britt, I think I have addressed this issue. As I mentioned, the words we use do not define the the actions that we take. The challenge that we confront defines the actions that we take, and we are using every ounce of energy and resource we have to address the challenges not only at our southern border with respect to irregular migration, not only with respect to trafficking of fentanyl, but across the entire breadth of mission of the Department of Homeland Security.
Respectfully, Mr. Secretary, it's not enough. We have a humanitarian crisis, a national security crisis, the face of which becomes very real. You mentioned your trips to the border. I have went to the border 3 times in the first 2 months to see it myself. When you have a border that is 2,000 miles long, there's no way to capture it all without going and seeing and continuing to look and learn. We must do better. Our border is not secure, and we owe it to the citizens of this nation. We owe it to the people who are being trafficked by these drug cartels to take back control. Speaking of, the Border Patrol chief this month said, quote, "The cartels control an awful lot of the southern border south of the United States," end quote. Yes or no, do you agree with that statement?
That is Chief Ortiz, whom I selected to lead our Border Patrol, and I'm very proud of his leadership. I do believe that the cartels control a significant amount of territory south of our border, which is why we have an all-of-government effort to attack those cartels.
So I agree as well, and when you visit, it becomes very clear. Following up on that, do you believe that the cartels have a growing influence north of our southern border?
I believe that they have their tentacles in the United States, as they have had for many years. They have grown significantly in sophistication and size and capability since I spent my time prosecuting members of that organization when I served as a federal prosecutor.
And Mr. Secretary, I'm out of time, but I will say I agree. When we look at what drug cartels are doing, not only south of our border, but here in our country, we are allowing this crisis to make these cartels rich to the tune of billions of dollars, and the cost of that, real human faces and children in our community all across this country. So thank you, Mr. Ranking Member.
Thank you, Senator Britt. We're going to give Chair Murray a chance to catch her breath, and I'm going to recognize Senator Peters.
Well, thank you, Chairman. Secretary Mayorkas, it's good to see you here today. I'll be seeing you again on April 18th when you come before my Homeland Security Committee for another budget hearing. So we'll look forward to that. So I have I'll have a majority of my questions will be reserved for when I see you later in April. But a few questions for you. One some related to my home state in Michigan. You know, ice breaking in the Great Lakes is not just for Michigan's economy incredibly important, but also for the entire country. Ice breaking capacity in the Great Lakes supports more than 90 million tons of cargo annually, and unfortunately, inadequate ice breaking poses a risk to our economic recovery. I was pleased to see in the budget there's a request for $55 million for long lead time materials and programmatic support, excuse me, for acquisition of a second heavy Great Lakes icebreaker. So, Secretary Mayorkas, my question for you is, one, first off, may I have your commitment to work with me and the committee to swiftly utilize this funding to get a second heavy icebreaker on the lakes, as well as to secure the additional funding to support the Great Lakes icebreaking fleet?
Most certainly, Senator, I do. I commit to working with you. These icebreakers are so vitally important, not only, of course, in the Great Lakes region, but in the Arctic as well, and that is why our fiscal year 2024 budget also provides for funding for a commercially available icebreaker. Our challenges in the Arctic are extraordinary as the People's Republic of China and Russia seek to expand their footprint there.
Great. Well, thank you. One of my own priorities as a senator, one of my top priorities, I should say, is always protecting the Great Lakes, in addition to having commerce move safely and efficiently across the waters. I worked with the Coast Guard and the Department in 2018 to establish the Great Lakes Center of Expertise for Oil Spill Preparedness and Response, which is in Michigan, and something that we're very proud that that's located in our state. The center is intentionally located not far from a major oil pipeline, which, if ruptured, could affect the drinking water for literally tens of millions of people. and I'm grateful to the Coast Guard for establishing the center, and I'll keep working to grow its resources and its capacity to serve the Great Lakes. So Secretary Mayorkas, may I have your commitment to work with me and this committee to support the Coast Guard's work in freshwater, which matters so much to us in the Great Lakes region?
Most certainly, Senator.
Thank you. Anti-Semitic incidents in the U.S. Reached their highest level last year since 1979, according to the Anti-Defamation League. And taken together with other recent events such as bomb threats against historically black colleges and universities and attacks against Asian Americans, it's clear that racial, ethnic, and religious groups are facing an increasing threat. One of the federal government's primary ways to help communities protect themselves is through the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, which provides funding to houses of worship and other nonprofits to protect against these often domestic terrorist attacks. Secretary Mayorkas, I'm pleased to see the President requested $360 million for this program. I've advocated for the same. Could you please explain why this investment is so critical given today's complex threat environment in our country?
Senator, the terrorism threat in our country has evolved over the past 20 years since the department was first created. We were initially, of course, in light of the tragedy and devastation of 9/11, focused on the foreign terrorists who sought to enter our country and do us grave harm. That evolved over the years, and during the Obama-Biden administration, during those years, the threat that we faced most prominently, though its prior iterations certainly didn't disappear, was the threat of the homegrown violent extremist, the individual already resident in the United States, radicalized to violence by a foreign terrorist ideology who sought to do us harm. Now, the greatest terrorism-related threat that we face, while these other iterations, prior iterations, haven't disappeared, is the threat of domestic violent extremism. Individuals radicalized to violence by an ideology of hate, false narratives, anti-government sentiments, personal grievances, other narratives spread on online platforms through social media. We see an increasing amount of violence by reason of ideologies of hate. And the Nonprofit Security Grant Program allows us to equip and empower local communities, places of worship, schools that are nonprofit organizations that are target-rich and resource-poor to build their security. While we partner with them, they also have to have inherent in their capabilities the power and strength to protect themselves. And that is why that program is so vitally important.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that continued support because it is vitally important. As we talk about border security, I always have to remind my colleagues, being from the state of Michigan, we have a northern border as well as a southern border. And as trade and travel continues to return to pre-pandemic levels, it's critical that the CBP has the personnel necessary to support operations at our ports of entry, including the northern border. So amid increasing retirement eligibility for numerous dedicated CBP officers, how are you ensuring that the northern border has the resources and the personnel it needs, especially as we near the opening of the Gordie Howe International Bridge, which will become one of the busiest border crossings in all of North America? In fact, we have a couple of the top 5 in Michigan in terms of the volume of trade that goes across our border.
Senator, the funding that we have received in fiscal year 2023, thanks to the appropriation of Congress, funds not only our Border Patrol agents for our border security on the south and the north, but also our Office of Field Operations officers that man the ports of entry that I know are so important to the states that border with Canada. And so in our fiscal year 2024 budget, we are seeking enhanced personnel precisely for that reason.
Thank you, Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Vice Chair Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin by saying that I am delighted that you and Senator Britt will be leading this important subcommittee. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, since January of this year, approximately 900 individuals have arrived in Portland, Maine from our southern border. They join thousands of other asylum seekers who have made their way to the state of Maine. I want to tell you a story to illustrate a real problem that we have because of the current law that prohibits asylum seekers from working for a number of months. I received a call last year from a restaurant owner in Freeport, Maine. He was desperate for more workers. He was having to curtail the number of hours that he could be open because of a lack of employees. Right next to that restaurant was a hotel that was hosting asylum seekers and their families. The hotel was full of them. The hotel owner wanted to hire some of the asylum seekers. In other words, we had a situation here where employers were desperate to hire these individuals who had made their way to the state of Maine, and these asylum seekers were very eager to get to work. They brought skills with them, energy with them. They wanted to be independent of local aid. They wanted to be able to support their families. So if we allowed asylum seekers to work after a 1-month vetting period, as long as they entered through a legal port of entry, 1 month would give us time to do an initial background check to make sure they weren't on the terrorist watch list, for example, and to verify their identities. Why couldn't we change the law and have a win-win situation here? The asylum seekers are eager to work and support themselves and their families. The employers in my state are desperate for more workers, and it would also benefit the municipalities that are under increasing strain as they're supporting thousands of asylum seekers. So Senator Sinema and I, along with a bipartisan coalition, have introduced legislation that would shorten the period to 1 month. Would you support such a bill?
Senator, thank you very much for your question. I very much look forward to working with you on that bill. You and I have spoken before about the great misfortune of having employers throughout the United States that depend on additional workers, seasonal or otherwise, and yet our fundamentally broken immigration system cannot meet that need. And I take a look at the country to the north, to Canada, and how their immigration system actually is more responsive to their labor needs than certainly ours is, whether it's the H-2B program or the fact that an asylum seeker must wait 150 days. I think it's 150 days since the filing of their application before they can apply for a work authorization. Our asylum system is fundamentally broken. Our whole immigration system is broken, and I very much look forward to working with you on a bipartisan basis.
Thank you. I'd very much appreciate that. We can't fix every problem, but boy, we ought to be able to fix that one. Let me, in light of Senator Peters' comments about homegrown terrorists and the domestic extremists, violent extremists, ask you about another issue. Increasingly, we're seeing terrorist groups in Afghanistan become far more capable of launching an attack on our Western allies or eventually on the homeland. Unfortunately, a great deal of material, weapons, and equipment was left when we did our hasty departure from Afghanistan. I'm very aware, having helped create the Department of Homeland Security, of your role in protecting critical infrastructure. What is the department doing in light of the increased threat of terrorist groups that are being given safe haven in Afghanistan?
Senator, your question goes precisely to the reason why, in sharing with Senator Peters the growth of domestic violent extremism, I articulated explicitly that the prior iterations of the terrorist threat have not disappeared. We have not lost our focus. Our Office of Intelligence and Analysis works with the rest of the intelligence community so that we have a clear understanding of the threat in foreign nations that could have an impact on the security of our homeland. And I want to assure you that not only the Office of Intelligence and Analysis, but our Customs and Border Protection personnel, our TSA personnel, our Coast Guard personnel, our entire department is focused on the very issue that you identify. We are not taking our eye off the prior iterations of terrorism because they have not disappeared from our threat landscape.
Thank you. Finally, let me very briefly mention and remind you of the pressing need for a new border patrol station in Holton, Maine. We're seeing a huge increase in the number of encounters on the northern border, and the President requested funds through your intervention for this station in fiscal year 2022. Congress fully funded that request, but last month I learned that Customs and Border Protection had decided to reallocate nearly all of the funds appropriated for the Holden Station to another project. And I would just reiterate that the current station was originally intended to support just 9 Border Patrol agents. It currently hosts 40 personnel, and the facility is in need of replacement due to annual flooding, toxic black mold, contaminated well water. It has a host of problems. I do appreciate that you included full funding for this project in the budget requests for this year, but I'm concerned that the funds that we previously appropriated for fiscal year 22 were repurposed, and as I said, I found that out not from the department in Washington, but from local officials. The new timetable greatly delays the completion of this new station, and now we'll push it from 2024 to 2028. I would just ask you to take another look at what was done in this area. I realize you may not be prepared to respond today, but if you'd like to explain the delay in the project and why the department disregarded the funds that were in the president's budget, again, I believe due to your intervention, and we approved. It's very frustrating to the hardworking Border Patrol agents in northern Maine.
May I, Mr. Chairman?
Certainly, quickly.
I'm very well aware of the unfortunate redirection of the funds from Holden to what I believe is the Laredo air facility because of increased costs in that urgent development. I understand the urgency of addressing the Holden station. We did include funding in our fiscal year 2024 budget. Senator, if I may, let me take a look at what we can do to address the urgency, and I commit to you that I'll follow up with you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, and thank you for your tolerance, Mr. Chairman.
Chair Murray.
Well, thank you very much, Chair Murphy and Ranking Member Britt. I really appreciate both of your leadership on this committee and willingness to really go to work to make sure we get the job done and put a bill together here. And as Senator Collins and I have said repeatedly, we have a responsibility to work in a timely fashion to write a bipartisan funding bill that will keep our communities safe and our nation competitive on the stage. And we're counting on the work you're doing in this committee, so thank you. And as we work to live up to that, this committee hearing is part of the regular order that is really part of that crucial step to start this process off on the right foot and assess our nation's needs and remind everyone that military spending is critical. It is just one piece of the puzzle. Funding for this subcommittee is equally important, and we have to make sure that we are doing our job with that as well. because frankly, our economy depends on our ability to make sure that countless goods and, well, people can move through our ports and borders in a safe, orderly, and timely fashion. And our security really depends on our ability to do all of this while effectively stopping threats like drug smugglers and sex and labor traffickers and a lot more. And this is especially important as we continue fighting the fentanyl epidemic. And we also have to stay vigilant against the growing threat of white supremacy and domestic terrorism and the rapidly evolving threat landscape when it comes to cybersecurity and our critical infrastructure. And last but not least, we have to maintain our reputation as the leader of the free world, as the land of opportunity, which requires us to continue our long tradition of welcoming people from across the world who are seeking safety from persecution and seeking opportunities for a better life. So make no mistake, it's not just our reputation as the home of the free that is made stronger by this. Throughout our history, immigrants have strengthened our nation. They've cared for our kids, our sick, our elderly. They put food on families' tables. They built cities. They built thriving businesses and vibrant communities, and that makes America, America. So I look forward to working with this committee to make sure we have strong investments, to make sure that we can build a strong future as well. So again, thank you for your work. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. I wanted to ask you, as we continue to see high numbers of refugees and asylum seekers fleeing persecution and targeted violence and the natural disasters that we're seeing around the world, we have to make sure that we treat unaccompanied children that arrive in the U.S. with the highest level of care. What is the department doing to prioritize forced labor investigations or labor exploitation investigations, particularly involving our children?
Senator Murray, thank you very much. We have dramatically changed the way in which we conduct enforcement operations at work sites. Rather than focusing our efforts exclusively on apprehending undocumented workers, we feel it is a law enforcement priority to focus our efforts on the employers who exploit those undocumented workers by reason of their vulnerability, that pay them substandard wages, that keep them working in substandard conditions, that hire and abuse children. And so our Homeland Security investigations special agents are focused on unscrupulous employers that not only protect the integrity of the workplace, but also protect the integrity of the marketplace, because these unscrupulous workers, by paying lower wages, create an uncompetitive landscape. So we are focused on addressing the employers who abuse these children and other vulnerable individuals.
Okay, can you also speak to what safeguards are in place to make sure that unaccompanied children are processed by CBP quickly and safely and transferred to ORR custody?
So we have, Senator, we have achieved greater processing efficiencies to ensure that we are able to transfer the unaccompanied children from U.S. Customs and Border Protection, from the Border Patrol stations that is no place for a child, to HHS, to Health and Human Services, within the 72-hour period that the law requires.
Okay, thank you. Senator Peters asked about domestic threats, and I want to echo his words and thank you for your response to him. Last year, I raised concerns about processing backlogs at USCIS. Those backlogs are still creating challenges for applicants who rely on USCIS services for everything from work authorization to humanitarian protection. How is the department using the funds it has already gotten to reduce and ultimately clear those backlogs?
So we are very focused. The problem that you identified, Senator, I am very well aware of, and Urjadu, our terrific Director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, is very, very focused on it. As a matter of fact, this past year, we processed all the economic visas that were allotted, a remarkable achievement. We have an initiative, and I would be very pleased to follow up with you to provide the details with respect to backlog reduction. Let me, if I can, share with you why we are encountering a backlog, because the prior administration completely decimated that agency. That agency was on the brink of financial collapse. Every 2 years, it is required to issue a new fee structure to align its fees with the cost of administering the benefits that it is obligated to do. It has not issued a new fee structure in over 6 years. We now have a notice of proposed rulemaking to realign and adjust the fee structure as it needs to be. And that is going to help us tremendously, as is the fiscal year 24 President's budget in resourcing U.S. citizenship and immigration services.
Okay, and quickly, I know we've seen our community step up and fill in the gap in providing services to our asylum seekers. I'm glad the department is working quickly to stand up the new Shelter and Services Grant Program to support states, localities, and NGOs. But how are you communicating and coordinating with those NGOs as they support asylum seekers?
So we have built an architecture where we have a point of contact, a designated point of contact in the different cities and regions, so that in fact the municipalities that need the services can actually receive them in the time that they do. And so we're very focused on that. And in fact, I was just in Tucson, Arizona, speaking about this very issue with the community-based organizations in that region that receive the funding under the Shelter and Services predecessor, the Emergency Food and Shelter Program.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Madam Chair. I'm glad to see us returning on the Appropriations Committee to what I'll call quasi-regular order, where our subcommittees are meeting and talking about the matters within our jurisdiction. And I think we should return to full regular order. I think whether we return to full regular order will depend on Senator Schumer. I'm not convinced yet that he will allow us to return to full regular order. I'm not convinced yet that he will give up his power to basically write the budget, he and a few other leaders. And I'm not convinced, well, I don't want to necessarily ascribe this to Chuck. Many people like an omnibus because they can hide the spending and because they have enough internal power to get what they want. And for everybody else, it's too bad. So I hope that we'll all encourage Senator Schumer to actually bring the bills to the floor, because that's going to be the true test. We can all meet and ask all these questions and pour over budgets that never have a chance to pass. It's going to depend on Senator Schumer, and that's kind of the bottom line. Mr. Secretary, yesterday, you testified in judiciary that you support an assault weapon ban, and we didn't have much time to talk about that. Tell me your definition once more of an assault weapon.
Senator, we did indeed have a brief exchange on that very important subject. I am not an expert with respect to the definition of the assault bans, and so I defer.
You are the Secretary of Homeland Security.
As I was about to say, I defer to the experts. I defer to, for example, the definition of an assault weapon that was codified in the prior iteration of the legislation that was passed and that was in operation when I served as an assistant United States attorney and the United States attorney in the Central District of California.
So you would support the prior definition under?
Senator, I must defer to the experts with respect to the definition But I will tell you, for example, military-style weapons are of tremendous concern. We are seeing too much devastation.
How do you define, but I mean, you personally think we should ban assault weapons, and I know you to be an intelligent man and a thinking person, so I know you've thought about it. What is it about a military, what do you mean by a military-style weapon?
Senator, I really must say that you are probing a very, very important area, definitionally, in which I do not have the requisite expertise. I will say this. When we see the tragedy in Nashville, and it is not the first such tragedy that we see, when I engage with my international counterparts and they ask me almost invariably first, what is going on with all the mass killings in the United States, and why are these assault weapons disseminated so broadly? I say that we need legislation to ban.
Let me follow up on that. So you support an assault weapon ban, but you don't have a definition. Is that right?
Senator, I think that you understand where I stand.
No, I don't. I don't. You made a very bold statement, very firmly saying we should ban all assault weapons. And all I'm asking is, what, in your mind, is an assault weapon? I mean, you say it's military style. Does that mean it looks like a military weapon?
Senator, I believe I've addressed your
I
question.
mean, what if it's a
I think-
single-shot .22 that looks like a military weapon? Would you ban that because it's scary looking to you?
Senator, I think I've addressed your question to the best of my abilities.
But you haven't. I mean, I'm trying to understand. You're Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. And as is your right, as an American, you believe we should ban assault weapons. But it bothers me, you can't tell me what you would ban.
Senator, I would be very pleased to speak with experts and confer with you subsequent to today's hearing and share with you a proposed definition that could be inserted into the legislation that is so desperately needed. Because I will tell you, the way I look at it
But
is I
Mr.
see
Secretary,
so much tragedy.
what if Senator Tester, my good friend, he's not here. What if Senator Tester said to you, I oppose illegal immigration, which I think he does, and you said to him, what do you mean by illegal immigration? And he said, well, I don't know, but I oppose it. You wouldn't accept that answer, and that's the answer you've given me. You said you want to oppose all assault weapons, but you don't know what they are. Can you give me an example?
Senator, I think I gave you an example yesterday, so I'm not exactly sure why you're posing
Which
the
one?
question.
Refresh my memory of the example.
I believe I said an AK-47.
Well, what is it about an AK-47 that you find to be objectionable? Is it the fact that it has a magazine?
Senator,
Do you know what a magazine is?
Senator,
But first, do you know what a magazine is, Mr. Secretary?
yes, I do. And Senator, what I've come to do is testify to this committee and not take an examination with respect to questions that I've already answered to the best of my ability. And so I think it is self-evident why an AK-47 should be banned, as just one example. But I look forward to conferring with you.
Except you can't
subsequently.
explain what one is.
I think, Senator, that
Senator's time has expired.
Senator, we've seen enough tragedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Just reminding our colleagues that this is not the Judiciary Committee, this is not the Attorney General, this is the Secretary of Homeland Security.
I realize that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Sheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Mayorkas. As you know, the H-2B visa program is a very important tool for seasonal employers and for others who need foreign workers to fill temporary jobs when no Americans are available. I think every New Hampshire business I've visited in the last several years has had a workforce shortage. They can't get the workers they need. And I appreciate the administration's decision to provide 65,000 additional visas in fiscal year '23, but I'm still hearing from people that it's not enough from our businesses. So how is the department working to fairly and expeditiously provide access to the visas, and what, in your view, needs to be done to reform this program to ensure that it works effectively for our small businesses?
Senator Shaheen, the H-2B program, the seasonal non-agricultural worker program, is in desperate need of legislative reform. I hear, too, from businesses all across the country, the need for additional labor. Thank you. Excuse me. The need for additional labor. And we see also people to the south of our border desperate for work and the remittances that they could provide, who would take a lawful pathway and not end up at our southern border irregularly. So this is a perfect example of the reform that we should be able to implement as a country that will address a number of challenges. We need more visas, and we need a more nimble system to address varying degrees of urgency in the marketplace. The one thing that we have done is we have improved our processes to, as expeditiously as possible, administer those visas, of course, in conjunction with the Department of Labor and the Department of State.
Can I interrupt you just for a minute, because help me understand what we need to do to ensure that there are more visas available.
We have, I have exercised, number one, our statutory authority, as well as the discretion authority that I have been given under statute. So we have not only issued the maximum number of H-2B visas, but this year I exercised my discretionary authority as early as I did,
Right.
which is the earliest time, I think, in certainly recent memory. We also intend to issue in the next few weeks a notice of proposed rulemaking with reforms to the H-2B program within the context of our administrative authorities, of course, but fundamentally, we need legislation.
So in order to increase the number above the additional 65,000 that you all allowed, we need legislation to make that happen.
Yes, the 65,000 plus the
The
discretionary authority
right.
to increase the number, we need legislation.
I've also heard from many of my small employers who have had those visa workers coming back year after year that the costs have gone up dramatically this year. Is that a concern that you're hearing as well?
Senator, I have not heard of that concern. The concern that I have heard most loudly is with respect to the number of visas available and, quite frankly, the dysfunction that a lottery
Right.
system creates. But I will look into the cost issue.
Thank you. Several people have mentioned the concern about the amount of fentanyl that's coming into the United States. My home state of New Hampshire has been very hard hit, and we're seeing numbers this year of overdose deaths that equal what we saw back in 2017. So the problem is getting worse, as we all know, not better. Can you talk about what we need to do to increase non-intrusive screening of vehicles coming across the border through the legal ports of entry, which is, as in talking to the administrator at DEA, it seems clear that most of the illegal drugs are coming across through legal ports of entry. And I understand you're hoping to increase the rate at which vehicles can be screened for illicit cargo. What do we need to do to make that happen? Do you need more resources? How do we get to 100% of screening?
Senator, we need more of the technology, which is why the President's fiscal year 2024 budget has $305 million allocated to it. We need more technology. We need more personnel to work the technology, if you will. We need modernized ports of entry that allow for the most effective use of the technology. And we do, in fact, have a port of entry modernization plan, given the infrastructure dollars that we've received. We also need to harness artificial intelligence and innovation to make sure that we're maximizing the utility of new capabilities. And I have tasked the Homeland Security Advisory Council to review artificial intelligence and how it can be used at our ports of entry to more effectively detect and interdict fentanyl and other contraband from coming through.
Well, thank you. I hope this committee will look at the resources that will give you the technology to do that screening at the border. Last week, the International Refugee Assistance Project released the results of a Freedom of Information Act request that showed that less than 1% of Afghan humanitarian parole applications were approved, and just 44% of fee waiver applications were granted. Why did DHS reject a proposal to waive fees for Afghans applying for humanitarian parole? And I understand at the same time that happened, DHS decided to waive all fee requirements for Ukrainians fleeing the war in Ukraine, but not for Afghans or other refugees. And while I certainly support waiving the fees for Ukrainians, I think given the dire situation in Afghanistan, we ought to be taking a look at that issue as well. So do you have an answer for that?
Senator, that's a very serious issue, and I need to look into that, and I will do so with urgency and be in touch with you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hyde-Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Secretary Mayorkas. I just want to, first of all, thank you for coming to Mississippi over the weekend. That was just a tremendous support that we needed. And when we're in the tornado outbreak, we were just totally devastated, and I just appreciate your prompt approval of Mississippi's request that we put in and how it was expedited. And I just look forward to continuing to working with you on that because it was critical, and you and the head of FEMA showing up on the ground on Sunday meant more to Mississippians than you will ever know. I truly appreciate that. Now I want to talk about border security as well. Senator Britt and myself went down and we met with ladies on the border that had been trafficked. Young lady named Carla. And just as a mere child, at 12 years old, she was taken. And she is talking about the thousands of young girls that this is happening to. And Carla had been raped repeatedly for years. She did escape, but she continued to tell us about all the girls that are down there that have not escaped. And I don't know what the definition of crisis in your mind is, and I don't know if everybody's just been told under no circumstances are you to call it a crisis, but I assure you, Carla doesn't care who's Democrat or Republican in this room. But it is very real, and it is no doubt a major humanitarian crisis. Those are things we will never unsee and things we will never unhear from that young lady. But for the last 35 years, Custom and Border Patrol fleet has flown a fleet of about 100 light enforcement helicopters, happen to be manufactured in Mississippi. Very good, very proud of these. But it's the support that Mississippi has given the border secure missions. And with the help of Congress, the Border Patrol had started replacing old airframes with new helicopters because the need is so great in this crisis. But despite their finalizing the analysis of its aviation fleets and reorganization of these helicopters into the Light Enforcement Platforms Program, your FY24 budget request significantly underfunds that program. It is accompanying that they can buy one new helicopter, one. When we talk to the Border Patrol agents and say, do you need this? And they said, oh my God, do we need these? Because they have such a task in front of them. So again, as I asked this question last year to you, and I was told we would get a response, I just checked with my staff to make sure that that response had not come through. So I'm going to ask the same question that I asked a year ago, that we did not get a response. Why did the department not request appropriate funds to provide Custom and Border Control with modern, safer technology and the advanced helicopters that they tell us they need at the rate of the FY24 request? It will take 75 years for those Border Patrol agents to receive and to replace their current fleet that they are needing. So we didn't get an answer last year, but can we get an answer today of why that was not appropriately funded?
Senator, a few comments, an apology, and a follow-up. One, it is my thanks to you for hosting us in Mississippi and for your extraordinarily poignant and powerful words to the people with whom we met. Secondly, with respect to the story, the tragic story that you summarized with respect to the young woman at the border, that is precisely why, one of the reasons why we are developing and implementing programs that seek to cut out the smugglers that exploit the vulnerable individuals, that don't care about their well-being and only care about a profit.
But more than almost 250,000 came through in just December alone.
And
when
that's
you said we're using every ounce of energy to address
That's exactly
all
why.
of government effect, but almost 250,000 came across just in the month of December alone.
That's exactly why, for example, we developed and implemented the programs that we announced on January 5th to cut out the smugglers and for the Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, and Venezuelan nationals to be able to bring them safely in an orderly way under the law to the United States so they don't have to put their lives and their life savings in the hands of treacherous criminals that care only about a profit and not their well-being. I apologize. I am sorry to learn that you did not receive a response to your inquiry of last year with respect to the helicopters that equip our air and marine operations with a vital tool to secure our border. I am quite candidly not sure whether that funding is in the base budget or whether it's in the $4.7 billion border contingency fund to which the chairman referenced in his opening remarks. I will both circle back on that precise question, and I will be sure to respond to your inquiry thoroughly and very quickly, since we're long overdue. I apologize for that.
And it is a total of $8 million, but it's for one when they're telling us they need so many. And I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator. I think we'll have one short second round, but just from myself and Senator Britt, and then we can wrap. Just a few final additional questions for you. First, I thought you acquitted yourself very well in the conversation with Senator Kennedy. It's fair for him to ask those questions, but it's also, fair to expect that secretaries are going to support administration position, even if it's not in their jurisdiction. Also fair to believe that every secretary is not going to be an expert on administration policy outside of their jurisdiction. Secretary McDonough would likely come and say he supports the new asylum rule, but we wouldn't expect him to be an expert in the asylum rule. But I appreciate Senator Kennedy's questions, but I appreciate the nature of your response. I have two additional questions for you. One, we put in the last budget first ever specified funding for outbound inspections at the border, specifically targeting the arms trade and the cash that moves southbound into Mexico. And as you know, this is a very specific and understandable ask from the Mexican government that if we are asking them to be much more serious about the flow of fentanyl north, that we should be much more serious about the flow of arms and cash, which facilitates that trade heading south. I don't know whether you have an answer for today or you can get us an answer, but I would like to get an update on the schedule of expenditure for those dollars. I'd like to know if we have begun those outbound inspections looking for illicit arms trade or illicit cash moving south across the border.
I will follow up with a detailed accounting, Mr. Chairman. Let me assure you that we are indeed very focused on the movement of funds and arms to the south because the cartels are being equipped with both. And so we are very focused on interdicting the movement of arms and cash.
Yeah, important to note that there is one gun store in Mexico. It's largely a store selling to the military, which is why, you know, upwards of 70% of the crime guns that are recovered in Mexico originate from the United States, and we should be expected to do much more about that. Lastly, on DRF, you've requested about $20 billion, which is the full amount that you can request that doesn't require a score from CBO. But my understanding is there's not going to be a lot of money moving from 23 into 24, so not a lot on top of that $20 billion, even if we were to authorize that full amount. Makes me a little bit worried that that number is not going to be enough for the coming fiscal year, and we're going to have to come back and do some emergency expenditure, which will be very difficult, sort of under the current circumstances in Congress. So are you confident that that $20 billion request is enough to be able to meet the needs in 24? Obviously, you don't have a crystal ball, but that looks like it's going to leave you a little thin.
Mr. Chairman, we're very worried about the condition of the DRF, of the Disaster Relief Fund, in fiscal year 23. In this particular year, and we're watching that very closely because of the increase in frequency and gravity of severe weather events, and also of the impacts, of course, on COVID, which have intertwined very closely with the use of the DRF. That is our best estimate of security for the Disaster Relief Fund, but I look forward to working with you on that assessment.
Senator Britt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So a couple more questions. Did want to echo what Senator Hyde-Smith said. Obviously, our state was ravaged by storms in January, and your team was on the ground, particularly Deputy Administrator Hooks, who did an excellent job. We still have a long road to recovery, but certainly appreciate the important work that FEMA does. Also, in addition to following up on a couple of things, I wanted to see if there's an opportunity to get a commitment from you on a few different items that I think are outstanding, and some of which would be very helpful as we work to navigate this journey forward. So the President announced that Title 42 will end on May 11th, and the department's own projections, as we've discussed here today, are that encounters will double from today's level to as many as 12,000 encounters daily. Despite multiple requests, the department has not provided details of how it will handle that expected surge. Can you make sure to commit to us that you will provide that information? Is there a plan in place currently? And if so, can we have that by April 12th in 2 weeks?
Oh, Senator, we can get that plan to you very quickly. We published its first iteration in September of 21. We updated the plan in April of 22. We have added to it through the programs that we announced on January 5th. We have our notice of proposed rulemaking. So I'd be very pleased to get you those materials. Thank you also for, again, commending Deputy Administrator Hooks. I passed on your compliment to him, and he was very, very appreciative and touched. It meant a lot to him and to all of us.
Well, thank you. Similarly, the department has failed to provide responses to a number of requests from this committee, several of which were required under the FY23 omnibus. In particular, the first report on how the department plans to spend the $1.8 billion in FY23 border funds. It was due 6 weeks ago. We did receive that yesterday, so that's convenient that we were able to wrap that up right before today. But the next report is due in 2 weeks. Will you commit to having the department provide these reports on time as required by law?
Ranking Member Britt, I assure you that we will use our best efforts to respond to the letters we receive very promptly as possible, and to submit the reports as required by law. I do want to say, because our personnel, a few of whom are seated behind me, are working almost 24/7 to be as responsive as possible to Congress. The one recommendation of the 9/11 Commission that has not been implemented is a refinement of the number of committees of jurisdiction over the Department of Homeland Security. I cannot overstate the number of letters that we receive, and that is the responsibility of Congress to probe us, and so I don't shrink from that. The number of letters that we receive on a daily basis, the number of reports that we have to complete, we are doing our mightiest.
And Mr. Secretary, we are as well, as we work to get back to regular order and we make important decisions. It's important for us to have that information so that we can move forward fully.
We will move with great speed.
Yes, and lastly, in this same line of questioning, what are you doing to deal with the 600,000 people who have come over, migrants who have come over that have been paroled into the United States? I know we've looked at this. The department has yet to provide a plan on how you're going to tackle that. And I wanted you to see if you could tell us kind of how you plan to move forward with that.
With respect to individuals who've been paroled into the United States, they are they should be in immigration enforcement proceedings. And if their claims succeed, then they are provided relief under our laws. If their claims fail, then they will be issued an order of removal, and we will seek to remove them from.
I am concerned about that backlog. Can you commit to an open dialogue between your senior staff and my team to make sure that we are up to date on that?
Most certainly.
Okay. And lastly, I will just end with, you said specifically that the prior threat has not gone away when it comes to terrorism abroad and what we've seen in Afghanistan, both previously and now. We know that under the Biden administration, we've seen 1.2 million gotaways at our border. And we know that that threat is real. And I want to reiterate my concern. President Biden said himself that budgets are statements of value. I value the work that this department can and should and will be doing. And I hope that we see that same commitment from the administration as well.
Senator Tester.
I want to thank the chair and the ranking member for holding this hearing, and I want to congratulate you on being appointed to run this committee. I look forward to great things out of you guys. I want to thank Secretary Mayorkas for being here. And I want to thank the people that you represent that work in all the capacities of DHS. It's a big organization. We've probably been over this ground, but I'm going to tell it again. Last week, I met with law enforcement officials from across southwest Montana about crime. It was a 45-minute meeting. The first 35 minutes of it was spent on fentanyl. They told me that in 2020, a third of a pound of fentanyl was seized in Montana. In 2021, 5 pounds. 2022, 36 pounds. They're on track to see even an equivalent bigger increase this year. You know about this. It's been brought up here today. Mexican drug cartels are trafficking fentanyl and other dangerous drugs across the southern border. I was told that you could buy a pill of fentanyl for a nickel on the border. They sell for 15 to 20 bucks up where I live. I was told we have cartels in Bozeman, Montana. And I can tell you that where Montana used to be classified as a place that you never heard about a police officer getting shot, Now it happens with way, way, way too much regularity. This crap's coming across the border. As you've already pointed out, it's coming across our ports of entry. What needs to be done here? Number one, and I want you to be blatantly honest, because this is really, really, really bad. I was in a Defense Committee hearing yesterday, and they were talking about people that serve in our military being caught up on this crap, fentanyl. So the question for you, Secretary Mayorkas, is what can you do? What are you doing? And does this budget support getting this crap out of a place like Montana, which is a long ways away from the southern border? And there may be some trickling through the northern border, but I think you and I can both agree the problem is the southern border.
Senator, the scourge of fentanyl, more than 90% of it is indeed coming through the ports of entry on the southern border. And if I can take a step back, I served, as you know, as a federal prosecutor for 12 years. I prosecuted cocaine trafficking, methamphetamine trafficking, marijuana trafficking, black tar heroin. They don't compare to the scourge of fentanyl. It is very cheap to manufacture. It is very easy to conceal because it's in pill form, and its addictiveness and toxicity outpace the other narcotics, the controlled substances that I mentioned. This fiscal year 24 budget does address the Department of Homeland Security's financial needs, our resource needs to continue the fight against fentanyl. I want you to know that we are not alone in this fight. The President has directed an all of administration effort, and this is not only a domestic fight, but it's an international fight as well. We are surging resources, personnel, technology, and other capabilities that we have to bring to bear to the ports of entry. Last week, I announced Operation Blue Lotus, that dedicated Homeland Security investigations special agents to the ports of entry so that they are there not only to help interdict, but to critically investigate and help prosecute the individuals who are trafficking in the substance.
So the idea has been broached to me, and I haven't found why it wouldn't work, that we declare the cartels that are bringing these drugs into the United States as terrorist organizations. What is your view on that?
Yep. So one thing I failed to mention in response to your prior question, forgive me, Senator, that we have to attack the supply, and we also have to address the demand side.
Correct.
Yeah.
The demand side of things is more on the education thing. You're more on the supply side of things.
Correct.
That's why I'm asking you these questions.
Correct. Absolutely. But I just didn't want to fail to mention that. So we are attacking the cartels with every force that we have available to us.
Wouldn't designating them as a terrorist organization give you more tools in your toolbox
So the question of
to get rid of these miserable SOBs?
So the question of whether they should be designated a terrorist organization is outside the province of the Department of Homeland Security. That is in the jurisdiction of the Department of State.
I've got you.
Yeah.
I've got you.
So-
But, you know, I'm sitting here with Murphy and Britt and all these good people. We might be able to do something if you were to say something like, it could be helpful.
I think it's a very difficult question to answer because of the following reason. Where is the line between criminality, however heinous, and terrorism? And that is a very complicated question, and one that I would be very pleased to really discuss with you thoroughly.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's all in the definition, but the truth is that what these folks are doing to the people of this country, it'd be hard for me not to classify it as a terrorist act, because we're killing folks right and left. We're killing folks that are young. We're killing folks that are middle-aged. I mean, it's just insanity. And we've got to figure out how we're going to fix it, and we're depending on you to do that. And we're depending on this budget to do that. And so we'll keep that in mind. I want to talk about border crossings and the amount of time I've got left here, and then one other short issue. But you know very well I live within about 70 miles of the northern border. You also know very well that Canada is our #1 trading partner. You know very well that those ports of entry are critically important when it comes to doing trade. We had a port in Raymond, Montana, in the northeast corner of our state. It was a 24-hour port. It ain't a 24-hour port anymore, and it should be. It should be taken back to pre-pandemic hours. And I could say that about the 16 or 18-hour ports in between Coots and Raymond, that they need to be at capacity from before. Now, I know you've got a manpower issue, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. You've got a manpower issue, but when can we expect these ports to be reopened to pre-pandemic hours?
So, Senator, the reduction in the port operations, as I understand it, on the northern border, because I looked into this over the past week, was not necessarily a reduction in hours by reason of the pandemic, but rather a resource allocation, because we were taking a look at the number of people actually crossing in certain ports and questioning.
Yeah, but this is a chicken and egg situation.
Well,
I mean,
no,
if you shut those borders down, they're not going to come there. If the hours are reduced, they're not going to come. And I can tell you why this is important. It's important because I hear it everywhere along the northern tier of Montana. Everybody's talking about when we could get these ports open. And I will tell you that I know, sitting 12 miles west of Big Sandy, that if I go to the Port of Raymond, it's not going to be open. And it used to be 24 hours a day. So I'm going to go somewhere else. And if I know that, everybody knows that. So that's the point. The point is you can't go by traffic when, in fact, people aren't going to go there because of the hours.
Senator, let me, I know the assessment of the port hours is underway. Let me get back to you. Let me speak with Customs and Border Protection and get back to you.
I would like that. I will tell you that I think it does not behoove this administration. It certainly doesn't behoove our economy not to have those ports open. And I know you can say, well, you know, there was only 5 cars or 50 cars or whatever the metrics are. But the bottom line is that it is very, very important that those ports remain open because it is our #1 trading partner. And it is really important. I just want to ask you one thing. In my notes that my crack staff gave to me, it says $30 million to hire 100 new Border Patrol agents. Is that accurate in this budget?
I have to get back to you.
You can get back to me,
on
but
the
let me tell you
precise
how the
number.
math works out on $30 million for 100 new border agents. And I did it with my pen and pencil, and I thought, that can't be right. So I brought up my calculator, and I did it again. It's $300 grand a patrol agent. I'm ready to go to work for you tomorrow. I'm just telling you, if those are the kind of wages we're paying, okay? I mean, these folks earn every penny they get, and I'm not denying that, but 300 grand per patrol agent seems a bit high to me.
That is not their annual salary.
Even if it's a recruitment situation,
no, no.
somebody's making bank that's recruiting these folks.
I have to break down the numbers. I'll follow up with
I
you.
appreciate it if you could do that. Thank you. Senator Murkowski, I guess. They never told me I had the gavel. But
I
we'll roll.
know, and you look what happened.
Yeah, I know. You've got it. Well, good. I can leave. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Secretary, I know you have had a long morning and, or I guess long afternoon here with the committee. I appreciate you. I think we're just about to the end. When I was here earlier, there was a lot of discussion about the southern border, and appropriately so. But as you and I have had an opportunity to discuss, Alaska is also a border state, a northern border state with extensive border. And I think when we saw the Chinese spy balloons floating overhead, people around this country were reminded that Alaska is really the first line of defense for our nation up there. We had, in addition to the spy balloons, we also had the 2 Russian nationals come to our shores, to St. Lawrence Island, seeking asylum. It took nearly 2 days for Homeland Security assets to respond. But you have noted, and I appreciate it in your statement, and particularly the focus as we're thinking about those assets, we need to have Arctic infrastructure to include polar security cutters and the reinforcement there. You said that the top two priorities of the Coast Guard's budget are the OPCs and the polar security cutters, and advancing the Great Lakes icebreaker acquisition. I heard your comments to Senator Peters there. The commercially available icebreaker is not listed on your priorities. You did reference it here. But we have a situation where, again, this year, the President's budget requests $150 million to support the acquisition of a commercially available polar icebreaker. So why is it not included as a stated priority within the budget?
Quite frankly, Senator, I have to look into that because it should be.
Okay.
Because
That's encouraging for me to hear, because it was our understanding that that was to be a priority, and that we were all recognizing that this was going to be that gap filler, if you will. Is that correct still?
yes, Senator, let me assure you that we're treating it as a priority. We are woefully under-resourced in the Arctic, especially given adverse nation states' focus on the Arctic. It is an incredibly important region. You and I have discussed this before, and if it's not named as a priority, let me assure you that we are treating it as a priority. The funding for the commercially available icebreaker is critical for our footprint in the Arctic, and when we get it, we'll still be behind, but we'll be that much better resourced.
Well, thank you for reinforcing that it will be a priority. But as we make that commercially available icebreaker a priority, we cannot take our eye off the ball, which is the full complement of our polar security cutters and that line that this committee, that this Congress has authorized. I want to ask about the progress, because I'm really concerned about what we're seeing with the level of progress with polar security cutters. And maybe if you can speak to the level of coordination on DHS budget priorities between your office, the White House, and then subcomponents like the Coast Guard. Last year, as I'm sure you know, the prime contractor for the polar security cutters was acquired by Bollinger Shipyards for a pretty nominal sum. There was an article that was a little bit disturbing. This was in Forbes, and they said, the fact that VT Halter walked away from such a massive capital investment for so little should really put a chill over the polar security cutter program. Though nobody in the government's talking about it, the polar security cutter seems to be in big, big trouble. That's really worrisome to me. It is concerning when you have them recognize that they say, this is in the article, over the past 10 years, America's never had a shipbuilding program where the prime contractor, after struggling with a project, has simply walked away, leaving behind little more than massive capital investment and a huge multi-billion-dollar order book. They say it's extremely worrisome and begs for real action. How do we make sure that this program is not going to founder? How do we make sure that this program is on track? And do you have any specifics in terms of actual timelines when this first polar security cutter may be operational?
Senator, I'd like to get back to you on the specific timeline.
Okay.
The PSCs are a critically important asset for the reasons you have identified. Allow me to get back to you on the schedule, and I also want to, I'm not familiar with the Forbes article specifically, but I want to dig into the situation there.
Well, know that we're digging into it. We would appreciate your attention to it as well. As you note, we are lagging, and a commercially available icebreaker is just going to be a gap filler. We are at 1.5 icebreakers, if you call it that. We won't see an Arctic icebreaker until 2 of these polar security cutters are off the line. And in the meantime, as you know, Russia's not sitting still. China's not sitting still. I'm told that India is looking to build an icebreaker. At the rate that we're going here, it's kind of embarrassing to think that a country like India is going to have an icebreaker in the water before we would. So we've got to be moving here. I want to ask very quickly, about the overall Coast Guard budget, because as you know, we pay very, very close attention to it up in my state. What I'm told is that the Coast Guard's budget request this year is less than the FY23 enacted level, down from 13.9 to 13.45 billion. Now, Admiral Fagan has said, I'm confident that the trajectory of enhanced mission excellence can be matched by a similar trajectory of consistent 3 to 5% annual growth budget. This means that by 2023, the United States Coast Guard would be a $20 billion a year organization. I'm sure you're not going to find a better return on investment for the American people. I happen to believe very strongly in Admiral Fagan's comments that this is an extraordinary return for American people. I'm confused, though, because it seems that there's some rhetoric here that's not matching up between what is being said and then where we're putting the investment when we're actually seeing Coast Guard budgets going down. And it's not only the push in the Arctic and what we need to be doing up there, but as has been discussed, the Coast Guard's role in drug interdiction, in everything that they're doing with high seas, their job is just growing every day. Can you explain the discrepancy here?
Senator, I know that we are investing the fiscal year 24 President's budget invests, I believe it's about $1.6 billion in recapitalization of the Coast Guard. I know it involves very significant investments. I'll have to circle back with you on what you identify as a misalignment between the pronouncements of our great commandant and the budget that we've presented to Congress.
Well, know that we're paying close attention to Coast Guard. I'll have an opportunity to visit with Admiral Fagan as well. But if we can circle back on the polar security cutters and timelines, and as I have information, I will share it. I know that Senator Shaheen spoke with you about H-2Bs. Know that, again, what we want to do is get to a long-term solution to that program. You and I have discussed it repeatedly, and I've got that commitment, but we sure need to be leaning in on that. And then as a follow-on, I will just remind you that I'm going to probably give you a call and talk to you about an Alaska constituent that we've had a conversation about before and just kind of determine where we might be in that as well.
Very well. And Senator, I'll look forward to also speaking with you about the H-2B program, because I know the seasons are critical here, and I think I've obtained some additional information that'll be useful.
Well, if you have it right this second, do you have it with you? I don't mean to encroach on Senator Capito's time.
I don't want to misspeak, but I believe that the employment of returning workers may not necessarily count against the allocation, number one.
Right.
And there are Central American workers. We have dedicated a certain number of visas to the Central American countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. I believe it's Guatemala that has identified approximately 1,700 workers with experience in the seafood industry, some on the east, some on the west, and that may be a useful resource upon which we can draw to address the needs of the industry in Alaska. Okay. So I'll look forward to both verifying what I just said and following up with you.
Let's visit on that, because I'd also like to talk to you about the potential for the Ukrainian people that have come to Alaska, many of whom have had prior experience within the seafood industry and are looking for those opportunities, but we just need a little assist. So I'll look forward to that conversation. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you.
Senator Capito, and I guess you get to close it out when I'm gone.
It's just you and me. Thank you, Secretary Mayorkas, and it's good to be back on Homeland Security Subcommittee, where I was the ranking member with Chairman Murphy, and even though Ranking Member Britt isn't here, I know she will be great and working as well with the chairman as I was, so I'm happy about that. To be honest with you, just briefly, I know you've had a long couple of days. I was just in Mexico with the group that went to Mexico about 10 days ago. You and I have talked through these years as I was ranking member and chair on this subcommittee. The situation honestly hasn't improved, I don't think, at all in our southern border, their northern border. They're pretty much overwhelmed in a lot of cases. But I do believe the partnerships that we have with that country are extremely important if we're ever going to solve this migration issue. But I wanted to turn to the drug issue because this is really impacting, as you know, the state of West Virginia, but also our country. I guess just recently, I mean, I know we've given a lot of money for non-intrusive inspection, but we're still inspecting the trucks at the southern border is still very low. I don't know, 10%? Do you know the percentage?
Oh, no, a much greater percentage.
20?
I believe we are inspecting 70% in some of the ports of entry.
Really? Really?
I believe so, but Senator, I don't want to miss.
Okay, yeah.
So I'll
Maybe
circle
somebody
back.
can clarify that while we're chatting. But in any way, it's still getting through. It's still getting through, as you know.
Yes.
Is there some new fentanyl scanning technology that you just recently have deployed that you're aware of?
We've increased the deployment of non-intrusive inspection technology. We are looking at how we can harness artificial intelligence to facilitate the detection of anomalies, including, the hiding of fentanyl in compartments in trucks and in passenger vehicles. So that's something we're very focused on.
One of the new unfortunate drugs that is now peaking in certain parts of the country is this xylazine. Are you aware of that?
So I am. Xylazine is actually a substance that is sometimes used with fentanyl.
It's used in agriculture mostly.
Yes, but it's a illicit product that is used for an illicit purpose, and it is, of course, very, very dangerous.
Is it detectable?
The
If it comes through, can you detect it?
So one of the things that I saw in Arizona when I visited was our forward operating labs, which is we dedicate chemists, individuals with expertise, and the requisite equipment to be stationed at the port of entry so that we can actually identify with specificity and certainty the precise chemicals that are being trafficked
So you
through the
can
port of
identify.
entry so that we could actually refer for prosecution immediately. Not only interdict and seize the chemicals, but refer the individuals for prosecution immediately. It's having a very significant investigative and prosecutive benefit to it.
Well, I mean, the amount that is being seized from year to year goes up. So that's good. We're seizing more. But it tells me there's more coming through than, we know it's getting through. And I partially attribute it to the fact that our Border Patrol and our agents and officers are so overwhelmed with trying to figure out this human trafficking that's coming through the southern border in the numbers that we've never seen before, that you only have so much. And I'm afraid we're missing much, much more than we're actually seizing, which I believe that to be true. And I think it's because I think it's part of the issue is just the whole situation in the whole. So I'll leave that, my belief, on the table there. Let me ask you another question. When I was working with Senator Murphy here on more closely on the committee, always asking for new border agents, then it doesn't seem like they can ever hire up to the number that they've been appropriated for. I understand this budget asks for a few more, not a whole lot more. Are we at the levels of full employment with our agents? Are we still having to do special incentives so that people can stay longer after retirement, or they get a bonus pay, or something like that? I mean, I think it's reflective of the morale, which I understand is very low. So what is the situation with the numbers? And what would, just because we would appropriate to more numbers, can we actually get there?
So, Senator, you ask a very, very important question. So our fiscal year 24 budget, the president's budget, seeks resources to hire 350 more Border Patrol agents. We've been appropriated for this fiscal year to hire 300 more Border Patrol agents, the first time since 2011. The question is very important because it speaks to a recruiting and retainment challenge across law enforcement throughout this country. And we are very, very focused on recruitment and retention as a campaign We need the resources to hire the additional Border Patrol agents because we are doing everything we can to fill those slots. They are so critically needed for the reasons you have identified.
So can you give me the numbers as to how many there are right now and how many, if you add the 300, what's the max level and where are we now?
I certainly can provide you with that data. I will do that.
Well, what I'm trying to get at is you can hire 300 new. Are you down 500 or 1,000?
We are down some.
Yeah.
We have some vacancies. We're working very diligently to fill those vacancies, and we are, of course, obviously recruiting to fill the additional slots that we have.
Well, I think
What
part
would
of part of the issues have been that we've been asking these agents to do so many different things that they really are not in their core missions, and so because of the so many people, and we saw that when we went down, that you and I traveled together. And, you know, partially there's some National Guard people that come down, some NGOs that help, but essentially our border agents are asked to do so much in very, very difficult situations. So I, for one, and I know you do too, very much appreciate the work that they're doing. I hope you can get to the levels of which you're appropriated. But I just feel like law enforcement has an issue overall, absolutely, no doubt about it. But I think you have particular challenges within your department on this. So thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Capito. This concludes, I think, the Homeland Security Appropriations Subcommittee hearing regarding the 2024 fiscal year budget. I want to thank Secretary Mayorkas for his time with us. I know this is a busy season coming before Congress repeatedly. We appreciate your willingness to allow us to have this conversation together. We're going to keep the record open for 7 days, allowing members to submit statements and/or questions for the record, but that needs to be sent to the committee by the close of business on Wednesday, April 5th, 2023. And with that, this committee stands adjourned.